Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Today's presenter, Michael Carter, our live audience, and our online viewers, to the live science seminar titled Index-Based Insurance in Agriculture, Managing Risks and Uncertainty for Smallholder Farmers. This live stream seminar is co-organized by the CGIAR Research Program on Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security, also known as CCAFS, and the University of California, Davis. I want to take this opportunity to thank the University of California, Davis for supporting and hosting today's session. My name is Tara Steinmetz, and I will be moderating the live stream session. Today is the third out of 4 online science seminars organized by CCAFS this year. I'm delighted to welcome today's speaker, Professor Michael Carter. Michael is the director of the BASIS Assets and Market Access Collaborative Research Support Program and a professor of agriculture and resource economics at the University of California, Davis. He has been a visiting professor at various universities, most recently at the School of Development Studies, University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, and a visiting researcher at Centro de Investigaciones Universidad del Pacífico in Lima, Peru. His research interests include development economics, rural credit and insurance markets, agricultural development, and income distribution. The seminar will be divided into 2 parts. We will start with a 25-minute presentation from Michael on the limitations and promise of risk transfer innovations in developing countries. Michael will present case studies from East Africa, including index-based livestock insurance in Kenya and interlinking credit and insurance in Ethiopia. Michael's presentation will be followed by a 30-minute question, answer, and discussion session. During the seminar, online viewers can type in questions and comments via the chat window on the CCAFS live stream webpage. The chat window is found just below the video window. We strongly encourage you to debate online on the presentation topic. I will make sure to reflect the questions and debate for everyone in the audience here. If you experience bad video quality, you can choose the alternative webcast that has been adjusted to fit a slower internet connection, either using low or medium broadcast. If the video image freezes, try to refresh your page. You can also write in the chat window if you are experiencing problems, which our technical team will try to sort out to the best of their abilities. Thank you, and over to you, Michael.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I guess, depending on where we are. The live audience and I are here in the somewhat early morning. I only got them here with promises of copious amounts of caffeine, so I very much appreciate them coming. And more seriously, I very much appreciate this opportunity to talk on this topic, and I thank the CCAFS program for putting this together. So what I'd like to do today is share some thoughts with you on index-based livestock insurance. And this is a topic about which I feel a lot of enthusiasm, but I also want to make clear that it's an area where there's very much still to learn. It's something that we think can work, can hold out a lot of promise for development impact, but in fact we're really only at the early stages of seeing if that promise holds true. So it's an area I think worthy of further investigation. So here's on the screen now is a rough outline of what I'd like to speak with you about in these few minutes. The first, I want to motivate the topic by telling you a story I think all of you already know, and I've called it here the same old story about risk. In other words, many of us have known and been writing papers about or observing in practice that uninsured risk typically makes smallholder farmers underperform, use lower levels of technologies, and in a sense, making them poorer than they need to be given the available technological options. We also know that uninsured risk can keep people poor, and I make that distinction between making and keeping people poor to draw this distinction between income generating activities in a single year versus the kinds of decisions one makes over time. And so if risk begins to distort the way you save, the way you accumulate, it can also keep people poor unnecessarily over time. We also know from a number of studies, and indeed from common sense, as is the case for many things in economics. We also know that financial institutions are often allergic to especially the correlated component of risk. And when I say the correlated component of risk, I mean that risk which is common across individuals in a system. So think about a drought that influences many people at a single time. That's a correlated risk. And we get into then ultimately a vicious cycle in which financial institutions underperform. People react to that underperformance, to the lack of insurance or to the lack of credit options by making and keeping themselves poor over time. So that's the basic motivation, and I'll expand on that just a very tiny bit in a moment. After that, I want to then put forward the question, can we find a new ending to this same old story? And I want to at least suggest that doing so requires thinking a little more structurally about the problem. We can't just keep throwing Band-Aids at it, trying to fix the problems that are created by an insured risk. In fact, we need to think a little more structurally about the problem. And I want to suggest this hypothesis that index insurance, which pulls out at least the correlated component of risk in an agricultural system, holds out promise to create, if you will, a better ending to the same old story about risk. Then I would like to go into just a little more detail about index insurance. I want to describe its basic logic, the idea. And then I want to give you two examples of index insurance pilots that are actually underway right now and share with you a little bit about how they work and a little bit about what we're learning so far about whether this index insurance hypothesis can in fact succeed and craft, if you will, a new ending to this same old story about risk. And then finally, I'd like to say just a little bit about where I see the research agenda. What is it that we need to learn still to really convince ourselves that index insurance is a viable policy alternative, and what can we do to make it work better if indeed we feel the evidence justifies doing that. So that's my agenda then for the next few minutes. So let me start off then with just an example of the same old story about risk. And on the screen here is just a picture from the coast of Peru. The coast of Peru underwent a major land reform. It's still largely populated by smallholder farmers. It's an area that's had commercially exploited agricultural potential for a long, long time. A couple of years ago, one of my UC Davis colleagues, Steve Boucher, and some of his co-authors wrote a study in which they estimated that financial market constraints in this area was costing the agricultural economy about 25% of its output potential every year. And what was going on were really two kinds of constraints. The first were restrictions from the supply side of the market, so lenders themselves being extremely reluctant to lend to smallholder farmers, and that often resulting in what in economics we like to call quantity rationing. An individual simply cannot get a contract to finance a project, even though that project should be profitable and pay off in the long term. The other thing that was going on is a demand side phenomenon. We call that risk rationing. And indeed, some number of farmers were saying, well, actually, we can get a contract. We're lucky in that sense. And yet the only contract we can get is heavily collateralized. We live in a very risky environment, and we know very well that if things go wrong in the climate or in the economy, we're at huge risk of actually losing the very foundation of our livelihood. And we need that land for ourselves next year, and our children 5 or 10 years from now depend on that. So we find people, because of risk, refusing actually to take contracts for economic opportunities that are on average profitable. And so again, this is something we've looked at in a number of countries, this sort of dual operation of both reluctance of lenders to lend to small-scale agriculture and reluctance of at least some individuals to actually borrow those contracts which are made available. And risk seems to lie at the foundation of it. And as I say, these are not trivial costs, right? If an economy is producing 25% less every year than it might, that's quite significant. Tom Lumpkin, who's head of CIMMYT, now I heard him give a talk maybe a year or so ago, and he was expressing the same idea in terms of the yield gap, saying most small farmers are getting only a small fraction of the output which can actually be gotten out of the technologies and production methods which are already available. So there's this huge potential, as some economists like to say, money's being left on the table year after year. And that's bad for the economy, but as I said before, this is also a force that's making people poor. Switching to a very different kind of environment, an environment of perhaps much less economic potential, let's look here in the pastoral region, say of northern Kenya, southern Ethiopia. This is an area where some research has indicated that a poverty trap exists. And by a poverty trap, I mean there's a critical threshold of assets. When a household falls below that critical assets, they simply cannot move forward. They collapse into a situation of indigence. In northern Kenya, we've seen this process go on for quite some time, and we're now at a situation where perhaps 40% of the population is living on 20 cents to 30 cents a day. And that's an amount that seems to be there every year, seems to be increasing. And it's a prime example of a poverty trap. Now, in an economy with a poverty trap, risk can have several very pernicious kinds of effects. The first and most obvious one is if you're just above this critical threshold and a shock comes along, such as a drought, and destroys your assets, then all of a sudden you find yourself below the critical threshold. So a temporary shock has had a permanent impact on your ability to have your well-being. So let's call that sort of an ex post or an after the shock effect. That's really important. But people aren't foolish. They know that can happen. So looking forward, when a family says, how should I save? What kind of risk should I take? Should I try to build up more assets so that then in the future I have a higher income level and can give a better future, say, to my family? As they say, well, why should I do that if there's this very high probability that no matter how hard I try, I'm just going to keep getting pushed back? Okay, and we call that an ex ante or an investment disincentive kind of effect. So one of the questions we want to know, and we'll get here in just a moment to an example, is if an insurance contract is literally put in place, literally as a safety net to keep people from falling below that critical asset threshold, will that actually fundamentally change poverty dynamics in a region like northern Kenya or southern Ethiopia, where there's been this process going on for some time that seems to constantly replenish the supply of people who are living in really quite abject conditions of poverty. So in summary, there's the same old story, as I said, is that when there is uninsured risk, there is this possibility that people will make themselves poor. That is, there are opportunities that could raise their income somewhat significantly, and they don't. And moreover, it keeps them poor over time as they try to manage this uncertain and difficult environment in which they live. Now, this is not news in a sense, what I'm telling you. I think most of us that work in this area have been very sensitive and aware of the importance of risk for some time. The question is what to do about it. Public policies for years have tried to do this. In the 1970s and 80s, the public sector tried to step in and mandate insurance, and it just didn't work. They were massive money losses. They've tried to tell private lenders, you must lend to agriculture, and it just doesn't work, right? And the problem is there's a fundamental logic, there are fundamental structural conditions which are actually driving, private sector actors to stay away from these markets, even though they seem profitable in potential. So what I'm going to be talking now about index insurance and the hypothesis of it is if we can pull enough of that risk, if we can sort of change that structural reality in which a large portion of the risk that discourages individuals, that discourages financial markets or financial institutions from entering a market, if we can pull enough of that out, will we actually change the situation such that people can move ahead and take advantage of the opportunities which are available to them? So I think I've said most of this, and I can sense that I'm rambling on here a bit long. So basically, again, the index insurance hypothesis, we're going to look now at two examples, one in a lower potential area. We want to know, in fact, can you use index insurance to alter poverty dynamics, this poverty trap logic, which I described to you a moment ago. And we also want to consider in a higher potential area. If you provide an index insurance, if you pull out some of that correlated risk, can you actually get financial institutions to enter in? Right, to give people the liquidity and the capacity to adopt available technologies, number one. And number two, if you pull that risk out, will people actually be willing to take those contracts if they're made available? Okay, so that's the big challenge. So very quickly, just a slide or two on what index insurance is. Conventional agricultural insurance is an insurance contract in which payments are made to an individual based on the losses that they individually experience. Okay? Index insurance doesn't work that way. It doesn't measure or pay off based on individual losses. Instead, it pays off based on an index which is designed to be highly correlated but not identical to individual losses. So the simplest kind of index insurance might be a rainfall index. And if rainfall is 50% of normal, that means farmers are going to be having very high losses. So insurance payments are triggered on that basis. Now, the advantages of index insurance is you eliminate the transactions costs of having to measure and verify individual losses. In the Index Insurance Innovation Initiative, we have a project in Ecuador where we're looking at an effort to actually create individual insurance. We spent some time knocking around Highland, Ecuador with an insurance adjuster, and we figured out that it cost him $500, and the company $500, to visit one small-scale farmer and process the information about whether or not an insurance payment should be made after a loss. The problem with that is with small-scale farmers, the annual premium is about $75. Okay, so if it takes you about 10 years or 8 years of premium, just to make one farm visit, clearly it's not going to work. Right? Other things that are important in this kind of realm is index insurance is meant to be moral hazard proof. So moral hazard means that when I'm insured, I change my behavior and the probability of a payment increases. And so if it's just payment based on whether my crops fail, I can be negligent and not take care of my crops. Okay, that's a morally hazardous act. But if it's say a rainfall insurance, I can't sort of by goofing off, I can't make it more or less likely that it doesn't rain. I guess many people for a long time wish they could take actions that would make it more likely perhaps to rain, but as we know, that generally fails. And then finally, there's the problem of what's called adverse selection, where we know that sensibly the people that are going to be most interested in insurance are those most at risk. For conventional insurance, this can create a problem. For index insurance, it doesn't. It doesn't matter who's insured. That doesn't change the likelihood of a payoff of an index that is common to an entire region. So here's an example, and now I'm going to move into the index-based livestock insurance project in northern Kenya, or IBLI as we like to call it. On the screen here now you see pixels taken from a satellite. This is the actual region of Marsabit district, and if the resolution on your screen is good enough, you can see these tiny little blocks. Each of those is a measurement from a spectrometer, which is showing the color and the intensity of the reflected light, and it changes over time. And as you would, just in simplest terms, if there's lots of vegetative growth on the ground, you're going to see lots of color in the green. You're going to get a lot of reflected light in the green spectrum. And if it's a drought condition and everything's dead and brown, you're going to see different spectral representation. Now, what we did in northern Kenya, as we show here, we got two different sources of data. So the first was simply the satellite images, giving us, for rather small pixels, a representation of the reflected light or the quality or the quantity of vegetative growth. We also had long-term herd history information available to us. We put that information together and defined what we called a response function. So simply looking at the statistical relationship between what the satellite sees and the livestock mortality, which is the major nasty event that people in that region need to worry about. So we showed that in fact we could at a community level, we could get 70 to 80% of the total variation in livestock mortality could in fact be explained with the satellite derived information. And in fact, it's actually higher than that if you actually consider the large-scale losses. So if you look at when mortality rates are 5%, sort of small things, a lot of that is just idiosyncratic stuff that has nothing to do with drought conditions. But when you start looking at the kinds of events that actually drive people into poverty, when there's a 25, 35, 45, 55, 65% livestock loss in a single season, those are highly correlated and can be predicted very well with this kind of satellite information. So we formed then an index, which is essentially a statistical predictor of livestock mortality. We were able, using historical data, the satellite information goes back to 1980. We were able to derive its probability distribution, create an insurable product. It's now sold by a Kenyan insurance company, reinsured by a Swiss company, and it's been out in the field now for a couple of years. This is just a small diagram of the different, this is the Marsabit district, the general shape. The sub-districts within it are sort of our insurance zones. And we actually post on the web every couple of weeks the current status of the predicted mortality index so people know what's going on. And we did this in part to build trust amongst people that the satellite was actually seeing what they were beginning to experience. So I won't go into detail here, but spread across here is the evolution of these maps over a drought period. So the figure on the far left is actually before the drought begins. It's good conditioning, and the rangeland started to deteriorate. And then eventually, by the time we got to the end of the insurance period, the predicted mortality rates across this region were between about 25 and 40%, and insurance payments were triggered based on that. Okay, so the question is, in northern Kenya, we have made this work, right? We've made it function, right? So it's out there, it's available, people have purchased it, payments have been made to people. The question is, does it work in terms of its development impact? Because we've put up a pretty high bar here, what we're hoping to try to accomplish. So in order to study this, we put forward a 2x2 experimental design. So it turns out in the same area of Kenya, the government of Kenya, with the support of the British aid agency, DFID, I guess it's now UK Aid, put forward a cash transfer program. They said, so many people here are so indigent, we are going to give indigent families $15 a month so at least their kids can eat and at least there's some hope that their children can grow and become healthy and educated. And we said, that's great, that's a wonderful thing to do, but have you ever thought about the dynamics in the system that put such a large portion of this population into this situation of indigence? And would you be willing to support something to slow down that rate of collapse of people in there? So in this 2x2 design, we have 4 cells, as I hope you can see on this table. We have communities that are sort of pure control locations, no cash transfers, no index insurance. We have places only with the cash transfers, only with the insurance, and the places with both. And we're in the midst now, we're just doing our 3rd round of surveys in this region. And the hope is to see, as we examine this over time, will the overall poverty rates and the depths of poverty be different under these different sort of policy interventions? And we'll be looking to see what happens. Now, in this past, as I mentioned, over last year, in 2011, there was a significant drought event, and we weren't going to be comfortable waiting to find out over the long term because we think this is an important issue. So just as insurance payments were being made, we were going into the field for a survey round. And we put some somewhat speculative kinds of questions into the survey just to begin to get a sense. So we asked people in the 3 months prior to the survey, what steps, what measures had they been taking in order to cope with the drought and the kind of losses that they were experiencing. And then we told those who had insurance, we said, look, you're about to get a payment of X number of shillings. How do you anticipate this will change your coping behavior and your economic behavior over the next few months? So again, what I'm going to share with you here, it's not what people did, it's what people said they were going to do based on the payments they were actually going to receive. So that's not my preferred way of looking at it. We're collecting new data now where we can see if people actually did do what they said they would do. But let's just take a look at it because I think it is somewhat fascinating. So what we found is that, and we do sort of for those of you into this sort of thing, it's kind of a crude difference in difference kind of estimation. And what we basically find is that the most destructive kinds of coping strategies that people use drops by about 33% for the insured households. Okay, so the most destructive kinds of coping is perhaps that in which a family drops down to 1 meal a day. Okay, because that's there's a number of studies, there's been some excellent work done at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, showing that when you have those kinds of severe cutbacks in consumption and nutrition, everybody in the family obviously suffers and loses weight, but it's the youngest children in a family because of the biology of human development who suffer irreversible losses. The growth that a young child loses basically in utero to 3, 4, 5 years old, it's never recoverable. And that's just not physical stature, that's also mental development. So that kind of coping strategy, which when people find themselves forced to cut consumption to those bare minimum levels, that's extremely costly. And is a prime force, I think, behind the intergenerational perpetuation of poverty. The other thing I want to mention that's kind of interesting here is that we also find that in this area, that not only do people reduce their kind of costly coping strategies, a number of them also reported that they anticipated taking a number of the insurance payments and reinvesting them into their herds. Now, this is incredibly important in this kind of region because what one typically sees in a drought cycle is that the prices of livestock collapse. Everybody's trying to sell their few remaining animals so they can eat. Okay, so typically livestock prices will fall by almost 50%. So that means if you needed to, at old prices, you could have sold one animal to feed your family. Now to get the same cash, you've got to sell two. Okay, so it's understandable, but it contributes, I think, to this cycle of keeping people poor. And so what we discover here is that of those people who receive insurance payments, they're actually investing they say they were going to invest a fairly hefty amount into actually restocking their herds. And that makes sense to them because now they imagine they have money, right? And they know they're going to be fire sale prices. Okay, so that's good for them. But if you step back and say, well, what about the broader market? Okay, so if there's sufficient scale here, this would actually start to put a floor under the prices. And even for people without insurance, right, suddenly they've got a floor under the prices of their key assets. So maybe instead of selling those two animals to get to a family subsistence level, maybe only one. And that would be a huge impact also, a kind of a positive spillover onto other people. So we're continuing to look at this. I put these forward not that we can believe them. We can't believe anything, especially out of social science, 100%. But I think it's very provocative and at least suggests that some elements of the index insurance hypothesis might be true. Let me now say quickly about an alternative kind of use of index insurance. This is a project being implemented in a higher potential area of Ethiopia, further north from the southern rangeland type areas I was just talking about. And this is an area of small-scale farmers. This is an area where if you look into the production practices of farmers, very few of them are using the technologies that are available to boost the productivity by 25, 35, maybe 40%. Okay, so it's in a sense like that Peruvian kind of story. It's also an area where finance, access to capital to fund those kinds of things is fairly scarce. There's an off and on kind of government credit program, doesn't seem to work all that well. And indeed, the whole rural finance system was put on the brink of total collapse when there was a very large drought in this area a couple of years ago. Nobody was able to repay the loan. The whole system was decapitalized and in quite a big mess. So the question is, what if one comes in now with what I'm going to call an interlinked insurance and credit contract? What if insurance of an index insurance type is bundled together with the loan? Will lenders themselves then become more willing to make loans that they otherwise would not feel comfortable making? Because their portfolios will be more stable. And also something that I think is worth emphasizing, in any kind of smallholder economy that has any kind of political voice for the smallholders, if there's a major drought and there's a debt crisis, the first thing the farmers do is make appeal to whatever political system they have. And they say, you can't repossess us, you can't throw us in debtor's prison or whatever it is. You know it's not our fault. There was a big drought. Okay? This happened in Peru in 1998. It was called the Rescate Financiero. And what that did is the government said, you're right, it's not your fault, so we'll tell the banks not to force you to repay. Well, the banks said, well, great, that's really wonderful for you to say that. And of course, after that, the banks completely stopped lending. Peru is not the only example. These things are sometimes called debt holidays. But again, notice, a debt holiday is a product of a correlated or common shock. It's only when a large number of farmers in an area have been hit, then they can appeal to the political system. Okay, so what's happened in Ethiopia? So in Ethiopia, a research team led by a group at UC San Diego, FAO, and University of Athens actually talked a private bank, quite a large private bank called Dashen Bank in Ethiopia, into offering interlinked credit and insurance contracts. So the bank said, okay, we'll do it. This first year, we're going to put in 15 million birr, it's a little over $1 million, into this kind of loan portfolio, and we will see how it works. They estimated that in the regions they're working, that there's a total demand potential of about 50 million. There's a research design around this going to try to see if in fact this works. Does the interlinkage work well? Does it crowd in demand? Do people become more willing to prudentially take on the risk of borrowing money, buying hybrid seeds, trying to take a higher income yielding strategy? Will that work? And so that work is very much underway. This was a complicated project, took a little while to get off. The contracts went on sale just a couple of months ago, and the research design is chugging ahead to look at this. But again, it's another example in a higher potential area of seeing if this can happen. So I'll close up now. The final items I wanted to mention, but I guess I won't really have time to, is I think the basic point I wanted to make here, interesting area, high potential, if you will. It seems like it can solve some long-standing issues in the area. There are numerous technical issues. There are numerous sort of behavioral issues, demand issues. Those are all the sorts of things that we have to use. So moving forward, certainly one thing, my colleague Travis Libert, who's sitting here in the room with us today, he and I have talked about what's the right division of labor between agricultural technologies and financial technologies. A lot of excitement, justifiably so, about drought tolerance. But how does drought tolerance interact with insurance? So there's just many, many things to learn about doing this and seeing, indeed, as I said at the beginning, can we find a happier ending to this same old story about risk? So thank you very much.
Great, and thank you so much, Michael, for that presentation. Please feel free now to ask questions to our presenter. Online viewers can note down their questions in the chat box, which will be read out loud to Michael. There's still plenty of time to ask questions or comment on the presentation. For our live audience here, if there's anyone who wants to ask a question, please note that the microphone will be passed around and must be held close to your mouth while speaking to capture the sound for our online viewers. And now our first question for you, Michael, is going to come from online.
Okay.
Are there ways to target index insurance for vulnerable populations, for instance, women who tend not to own their own land, and when working in areas with high inequality? How do we ensure that the index-based insurance can benefit these segments of the population?
Okay, that's a great question. Actually, if I timed myself a little bit better, one of the points I think we need to work on is specifically thinking about women and women farmers, and what are the characteristics of an insurance contract that sort of best respond to the kinds of needs and concerns that women might have. So to give you a concrete example, if women are in a particular culture happen to be the one that are most concerned about childhood education, and that means school fees and it means certain kinds of regular payments, how does that feed into this kind of system? I mean, at first glance, you might think that's going to make women actually have greater demand for an insurance product like this, because they know to nourish and to educate your child, you can't do it this year, but not the next year, and then the year after, you need to sustain it. So those are some of the things we need to do, and we also need to think about the kinds of activities that women may actually be involved with. A little more generally, the question is also asking a very good one. When we think about vulnerable populations, how does this actually work? So Sarah Jansen, who's in the room with us here, is working on a study around the IBLI project in northern Ethiopia, in which we're actually trying to very much understand who has the highest demand for this kind of insurance. Especially, insurance is not cheap, right? And so will cash-constrained people actually be willing to buy it? So that's an issue that requires some investigation. I think the fairest 10-second summary of what Sarah's been finding is that some of the most vulnerable people may in fact not be willing to pay as much for the insurance, but they actually have a huge amount to benefit from it, and the elasticity of their demand for that insurance is incredibly high. So that suggests, if we start thinking about this, that suggests some smart public policy, some smart subsidies. And part of Sarah's work has actually been looking at what's the returns, say in a poverty metric, what's the returns to a smart insurance subsidy versus simply a cash transfer program. So, and again, I think this is a real frontier area that we need to think about, that yes, this can work for certain classes of individuals, but it's not exactly obvious how you provision or how you pay for this kinds of social protection.
Okay, great. And we want to thank, that question was from Kevin Coffey from the International Research Institute for Climate Change and Society. Thank you for that question. Our second question from online is, how can the Kenyan experience be duplicated elsewhere, especially in Africa, where there could be a patent lack of data about livestock losses due to drought? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's again a very great question. So we're actually wrestling with that. The team that includes ILRI and on this project is wrestling with that problem right now, because the insurance industry has actually gotten interested in this, and they want to roll this out across other regions in northern Kenya, where in fact this data does not exist. And so that was also on my list of great challenges. It's the scale-up question. So the examples I'm giving you right here, I'm going to call them handmade insurance contracts, right? So that is, we went to areas opportunistically where there happened to be good data, and we worked very hard to create what I called in the slides a response function. So the question is, as you move out across space, how do you modify that response function, especially if you don't have the data that you need to sort of fine-tune at each step of the way. So we're just getting started on that. I mean, we're thinking in our heads about a kind of a meta-analysis. That is, can we opportunistically find spots, say, at different places in East Africa and put them together and then start to look at how the response function changes, and then look at data that are available, such as latitude, longitude, slope, average precipitation levels. Can we do that to sort of modify that contract? Because we need to be able to do that if this is going to scale up. So again, I think the challenge is, things like satellite data are available, as the question suggests, but the data needed to ground truth it are not available everywhere. And so that's something that we need to work on. But I think this sort of meta-analysis is the way we have to go.
I also want to check and see if there are any questions in our live audience, with a reminder to use the microphone and hold it close to your mouth if you have any questions. In the back.
Thank you. So I was wondering, how do you determine the amount that you propose to these farmers in terms of payoffs and in terms of premiums? Because in your Kenyan project, we already see that when the premiums are quite high, when the payoffs are quite high, farmers' behavior change a lot, and they start to invest in their livestock and so on. So how do you determine it, and how does it change demand for the vulnerable people and so on?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so again, a very interesting question. So in the different projects that I've described and the other ones that are going on underway, both, there actually are different approaches to that. In the Kenyan example, you can buy the livestock insurance in sort of a cow unit, let's call it, or tropical livestock unit, and you can buy as few or as many of those as you want, sort of within the limits of how many animals you actually have to insure. So a number of people actually got fairly low payments because they were sort of dabbling, I suspect, right? They wanted to sort of see, is this really going to work? Or are these the city slickers coming in once again to try to rip me off of something, right? And so I think the benefit of letting people choose the amount of coverage that they want is that it allows people to sort of experiment. In the Ethiopia project, on the other hand, it's literally, the payments are set up to cover your loan liability. And so you can either have that or you have nothing, right? So you're fully insuring that loan or you're not. In a number of cases, we've spent, and Jean-Paul Petrard, who's here, has done some work with us in Peru and also in Ecuador. We spent a certain amount of time trying to gauge what level of coverage do farmers actually want. And so in some instances, you can, perhaps like Kenya, you can create an instance where people choose their level of coverage. Another way to do it is it's locked into a credit, and so that's sort of there. And a third way is to spend some time with farmers playing different kinds of experimental games to begin to get a sense for what kind of coverage they actually want. One of the points on the list I didn't describe of the ways forward is about we need to really learn from what we know from psychology and what you might call behavioral economics about how people really think about risk and what kind of risks they want to have covered. Driving in early this morning, I actually heard a U.S. public radio presentation by an economist named John List talking about loss aversion. That is, people respond differently to insuring against losses versus insuring against potential gains. And that's an example of an insight from behavioral economics that I think has been underexploited in terms of thinking about the structure of contracts. So we have in a number of the I-4 projects, we're doing different kinds of games. Do people want to be insured against losses? Does that make sense to them? Gains, and various kinds of insights that come out of that kind of approach.
Okay, great. Our next question comes online from Jim Hansen at CCAFS. CCAFS is trying to take a strategic approach to index insurance. Where are the big overlaps between knowledge gaps and CGIAR strengths? And how can the CGIAR best collaborate with I4 and other major initiatives in this area?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, thank you, Jim. So I guess the last question, we've started to try to work on it just by making sure that we're talking, and I think this event is a good opportunity. I think probably what we really need to do, I think we actually need to sit down a little bit harder and really think about what are the most promising questions to be answered. So as an example, it's often said, and it's not entirely true like most things that are often said, I guess, but it's often said that these contracts make sense, but there's just no demand. Okay, well, one understanding of that is that the contracts are not framed or structured in the ways people want to do them. To give an example from my own work, my first project in this area was in rural Peru, and we set a contract up in order to insure small-scale farmers against income fluctuation. And we said your income could be this or that. So we were framing it in terms of protecting prospective gains that people might have. As we stumbled through somewhat low levels of take-up early on, we had talks with farmers in focus groups. That's the kind of thing that, as a quantitative economist, makes me want to sort of take a bath. But we actually did focus groups, which is always, despite my sarcasm, is always a really good idea. And farmers said, don't talk to us about this. What we're really worried about is losing our working capital. So it's almost like they'd heard John List on the radio, right? It's like, we know that, we've got this block of capital that we have to invest in this project, and that includes our credit worthiness. And if we can't carry that forward into the next year, then we're in trouble. So what we want is an insurance. Don't get us confused about incomes we might get or might not get. Just tell us that this insurance will let us carry forward what we already have so that we can do this again next year. Okay, we reframed the contract and the demand went up by about 3.5 times. And Jean-Paul's actually been looking at this a little bit further. And the question is, so is that but that's just one example, I think, of it. I mean, I think another area where especially the resources of CGIAR could make a big difference is this scale-up question, because that's a tough one. I think it requires some pretty high-level analytical skills and data management and systems engineering even to be able to make that work. So, perhaps as we begin to find, as the number of pilots have begun to proliferate, those that look like they have good contracts, working together to then say, okay, how can we scale this out to areas where they weren't fine-tuned, it wasn't the handmade contract, but now can we have a machine-made contract? Because until we can have a machine-made contract, we're not going to be able to roll these things out to scale.
Okay, great. I'm going to take another question from online, and please forgive me if I pronounce your name wrong. From Jonathan Agwe at IFAD Rome. How do you convince pastoralists who are non-market oriented to buy livestock insurance when the prices they expect to receive for their animals is not that terribly encouraging? Okay.
So I hear two things in that question. So the first is how might you get a market-oriented person to buy this? And maybe I'm reading into the question a little bit, but insurance, even for a market-oriented person, insurance is a very unusual commodity. It's the one thing you buy, you pay your money, and you actually don't want to get anything back. Again, I heard a public radio story a couple of months, big drought in the Midwest of the U.S. this year. They were talking to some farmers who had a U.S. crop insurance program payment, and he says, yeah, I'm getting some money back, but we all know you're a whole lot better not getting a payment than you are with getting a payment, in the sense that in those years when you get a payment, you're actually having large losses and the insurance is only covering a fraction of them. And that's a difficult thing to do, is for people to understand that they're going to pay money and they're not going to be getting something every year. And we've, along with some people at Dan Osgood and others at Columbia University, we've worked on different kinds of experimental games so that people can actually learn by playing a game how a sort of a contingent contract like insurance works, that you pay every year, sometimes you get stuff and sometimes you don't. That's one aspect. I think the other aspect to the question is I guess whether it's a good enough deal for people to actually want to insure an animal. The way the IBLI contract works is the loss of the animal is valued at sort of the average price that kind of animal brings in the local market. Okay, so if it's a $200 animal and that's the normal price, then that's what it is. And so the price of the insurance is exactly tied to that. So if animals actually have a bad price, then the insurance doesn't cost very much. But the good thing from the person's perspective is that when that animal dies, they get sort of the average price back, so that they have a hope of jumping into the market later on and restocking their herd if that's what they want to do. I mean, the other thing we've talked about in this project, and I'm sure many people are thinking in their minds, gee, isn't this an area of overstocking of rangelands? Why in the world do you want to keep putting more animals there? First of all, it's not clear that the rangelands are overstocked except in a few localized areas. But secondly, by paying people in cash, what you've allowed them to do is at least hold on to some of their asset base. And we fully expect, and we'll be looking to see, people may say, enough of this. You know, I've gone through another drought cycle. This time I'm walking out with enough that if I actually want to get out of this mess and move and invest in another realm of economic activity, I can do that. And we don't yet know if people will do that. What we think is very important is to make sure people can ride through those cycles and emerge each time with sufficient, with an asset base that gives them at least some hope and prospects for moving forward in the future.
Great. Do we have any more questions from our live audience here?
Yeah, a question on sort of the relevance of index insurance spatially in different locations. So in the livestock case, where pastoralists hold a significant amount of their wealth in livestock, it seems like a very promising place to sort of balance the simplicity of a design on the contract side, something that they can understand, with something that's highly correlated with outcomes that matter to their welfare as households. In more complex settings, where maybe there's much more diversification on the production side, what are the challenges that index insurance faces in those settings to sort of balance the complexity of the design of the index so that it correlates with outcomes that matter to households and sort of trust and transparency in the product?
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question, and that was from Travis Libert, who's the person that generated the funny asset recursion diagram I didn't have time to talk about on, I think, the third slide. And this is a great question as well, and within the I4 initiative and other people who work on this, there's a big question as to whether you try to insure a particular activity. So in northern Kenya, you know, the predominant activity is livestock raising. So it's a simple economy in that sense, and so you can you can target and fine tune a contract. You know, do you do that, or do you try to create what some people call a generic product? So an example of a generic product would be a rainfall contract, and it just says, you know, when the rainfall is less than this, you get this payment. And then the question is, how do you set the payment that takes place when rainfall is 60% of normal or 50% of normal or 40% of normal? If you're targeting on a particular activity, right, then you can say, well, we know, you know, rice farmers or maize farmers or livestock farmers, we know that when rainfalls are at this level, this is roughly what their losses are, and that allows you to fine tune. There's one of the I4, a project that's partially supported by I4 and others as well, is run by Stefan Durkan and Ruth Vargas Hill. Ruth is at IFPRI, and Stefan is now, actually I guess he's been elevated to chief economist at DFID. But they've talked about trying to sell sort of blocks of insurance, right? And so, you know, if you're, you know, conceptually, and notice this is not going to be simple now, right? But conceptually, if you're a farmer and you say, well, when rainfalls are 60% of normal, I'm a dryland maize farmer and I'm lost. So I want to buy 3 blocks of payouts when it's 60% or less, right? On the other hand, if you're an irrigated farmer and you say, well, if it's 60% or less, I'm kind of okay, but I start having big losses when it's 40% or less. And then, you know, you could buy these sort of insurance blocks the blocks are generic. What wouldn't be generic is sort of the portfolio of how you put them together. Now, the problem is that's a lot. That's, you know, just saying we've got blocks for sale, how many do you want, right, is kind of difficult when you start getting into a more kind of mixed economy. You know, some people have argued that what one really needs to do, you know, there's a group run by Jerry Skees, who may be known to many people in the audience. They like to think they're trying to focus a lot of their efforts now on simply providing portfolio insurance to lenders and saying if we can just get, if we can just get let's call it state contingent repayment loan contracts. In other words, people borrow money for maize if that's what they do, or rice if that's what they do, and they know they only have to repay under certain weather kinds of conditions, and when those weather conditions strike, then the bank gets repaid by this. And so you're trying to push more of that analysis back into the level of the financial institution rather than onto the heads of people. So I'm not really answering your question in the end, because I think it's a great question. And again, the problem is that as you move towards a more generic contract, right, you begin to get to a situation where the index, the losses, the rainfall deficits, say, don't correlate as well with the losses that farmers have, and then becomes not very good insurance for the farmer. So another way to go at that, and it's also one that this Ruth Vargas Hill and Stefan Durkan project is looking at, is can you enlist local social organizations into some kind of internal redistribution scheme? So suppose you have a community that's got a heterogeneity in terms of what people do, what kind of resources they have. Suppose the whole community has a contract, and kind of on average it's right? So the insurance contract is set up for sort of the portfolio of the village. The question then is, can the village do its own internal redistribution and say, okay, well, this is one of those kinds of years where the maize farmers got hammered but the livestock people didn't, or whatever, and do that kind of thing. There's also an I4 project that Alain de Janvier and Betty Sadoulay at Berkeley are working on, trying to get off the ground in Guatemala, where they've played a number of games, seeing whether people within communities are more interested in an index contract that has an after-the-fact redistribution within the community to reflect that heterogeneity. Personally, I'm kind of skeptical about that. I think that's putting a huge burden on a community to make those kinds of decisions. But I think it's an incredibly important thing to investigate. And again, the key insight there is, at the local level, people know what happened. It's not, the information cost, the transactions cost aren't there. And then the question is, can you come up with a social institution that can sort of smooth out around that heterogeneity that people have? And it could be heterogeneity that results from the fact that some people do one thing, some do others, or it could be heterogeneity just in the fact that some people were lucky and some people were less lucky within a given year. But again, that's very much on the agenda, is trying to figure out, what's a viable index, how can you make it generalizable, but how can you also keep the insurance value strong enough for individuals such that it actually serves its development function. As the people that fund the I4 initiative and bases at AID said, this is actually not about selling insurance. This is about having development impact. And if you can't solve these technical problems, you might be able to sell insurance if you fool people or if you require it, but you're not going to solve the development problem. You're not going to get that. You're not going to take that money off that's left on the table every year, that 25% I mentioned at the beginning. So those are great challenges. And I think right now my approach is, let's see if we can make it work in simpler economies, and then as a next step, move into this greater types of heterogeneity.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes online from Doreen. How long of a drought period can be addressed by index insurance? What happens in the case of long-term conditions of 3, 4 to 5 years?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question also. So let me start with how the particular IBLI contract works, Doreen. So in that area of Kenya, there are two rainy seasons followed by dry spells, and so the contract is actually specified on each sort of rainy dry season pair, and at the end of one of those pairs, then payments are made or not made based on what happens. When we put this thing together, we had substantial discussion with the reinsurance company in particular about sort of correlation. That is it likely that if this year or if this seasonal pair is bad, what about the next one and the one after that? Okay, and the insurance company is obviously very, very worried about that. And there in fact is some correlation, at least in this area of northern Kenya. A bad this season being bad does make it somewhat more likely that the next season's also going to be bad. So there's some autocorrelation, if you will, in that kind of time series. We discussed this a lot with the insurance company. They called it, or we called it maybe, intertemporal moral hazard. So if you've had a bad year this year, you say, well, I better run out and buy insurance because it's somewhat more likely that next year will be bad. You know, one kind of solution that is not workable, you'd say, well, everybody's got to buy a 5-year contract. Okay, and you have to pre-commit to that. The problem is the liquidity requirements of that are gigantic. You know, one possibility here, and let me push us back towards a public policy kind of discussion. Certainly one thing we've talked about are sort of public-private partnerships in insurance. So should, you know, in many instances in severe natural climate events, government or the public sector in one form or the other, national or international, is kind of already on the hook. Right? So if you have a drought sequence or things are really terrible, governments respond, you know, and they need a budget for that. So one kind of idea is, should the government be making the 5-year contract, you know, for the tail end risk? And then if people want to fill in for higher, you know, let's suppose the government pays for the portion of the insurance that covers mortality rates in excess of 45%. And then people have the option to fill in and buy insurance and get coverage when it's between, say, 15% and 45%, right? Maybe the government can make that kind of long-term commitment. And then, you know, then there is going to be individual demand, which is perhaps subject to this moral hazard. I mean, our own sense, and we looked at this statistically a lot, our own sense is it's not, while there certainly have been drought sequences, statistically, we didn't think the evidence was real strong that, you know, that's a real significant kind of problem. But again, I shouldn't be I don't want to sound like I'm generalizing, but we all know that actually I went to a Jesuit university, and someone wrote a paper called "Do Jesuits Die in Threes?" And so this is back in Econometrica, believe it or not, about 1958, I think. I do not remember the author. And the question is, you know, when you see sort of random events like a death, when you think you see a pattern of correlation, is it really the case? Or if you take a bad basketball player like me and I make 3 shots in a row, does that mean that I'm going to make the next one, or is it just kind of a random sequence that pops up? So the "Do Jesuits Die in Three" paper was that while that was part of the folklore of the Jesuits, it was, in fact, if you looked at it statistically, yeah, there are some famous instances where 3 Jesuits died in a row, you know, within, I don't know, in a week or something like that, right? But statistically, it actually turns out not to. You can statistically reject the hypothesis. So again, it's a great question, and it's a very real question, and there is evidence that exists in some places. I think it's maybe not quite as severe statistically as we think, but in the end, I think if you get a government paying for part of an insurance and private people paying for the other part, I think you can begin from the insurance industry's perspective to take away their concerns with that kind of problem.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to try to sneak in one last question very quickly here. Biniam from Nyala Insurance asks, currently index insurance is focusing on drought only, but there are a sizable number of farmers exposed to risks like frost, excessive rainfall, other issues. What about working on indexing these risks?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a very great question, and Nyala Insurance, by the way, is the partner on the Ethiopian project that we just mentioned, and they've been absolutely fabulous to work with. So there's a couple of ways to think about this. In some environments, one can think about moving away from insurance contracts that are based on weather outcomes like drought or floods or frost, for that matter, and actually work on the value of output. So the project I mentioned in Ecuador right now, we're looking at farmers that are growing food crops, and we're trying to see if we can create a cost-effective area yield insurance. And the nice thing about area yield insurance, if you know the farmers in this relatively small locality, if their yields were 50% of normal or 60% of normal, they would get a payout. It doesn't matter whether it was driven by frost or drought or flood, right? You just have, if you have that kind of thing measured. And that's the nice thing about area yield. Now, area yield works really well if you grow either what I call inedible edibles. So I did work a long time ago on exotic vegetables grown in Highland Guatemala. We always called them inedible edibles because they were all marketed, because people would say, this stuff tastes terrible. We don't know why the gringos want to eat it. If we can't sell it, we feed it to our pigs. So those were inedible edibles. But if you have a highly commercialized crop like cotton and it goes into a channel, area yield is actually feasible. And we've got projects starting up like that in Burkina Faso. Right now. That's much harder to do in food crops because people sell some, they don't sell some. And then you need to find some kind of reliable kind of yield survey. That's actually what's done in the US. The US Department of Agriculture does statistically reliable yield survey. So I think for my own taste, I think we need to work harder on seeing if we can do area yield kinds of insurance. Working with Uniter Flatness, who's sitting in this room as well, we're trying to look at see what kind of yield predictors we can get, not from going onto the ground and doing crop cutting, but actually with the kind of extremely high resolution satellite. You can get satellite pixels now that are 3 meters by 3 meters. It's costly to get that, but as you get that, as you get into evapotranspiration and other kinds of measures, can you actually at high altitude get measures of yield that are gonna, and those yield measures will reflect all kinds of losses, be it frost or drought or flood. So that's one way to go. The other way to go is to simply have hail insurance and drought insurance and flood insurance. But then that starts getting kind of complex. But that's the other, that certainly is done in many parts of Europe and the US. You have this range of kind of contracts available for different named risks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think it's time for me to wrap up now. On behalf of CCAFS, I would like to thank you, Michael, for your interesting presentation in this exciting area of research. I also want to thank all our participants for joining and discussing with us, both here at the University of California, Davis and online. We look forward to seeing you again for our next online video seminar on the 7th of November with Dr. Mario Herrero, Senior Agroecological Systems Analyst at the International Livestock Research Institute. The science seminar will cover the topic of mitigation potentials in the livestock sector. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.